The Führerhauptquartier Wolfschanze, Wolf's Lair, East Prussia, September 24, 1942. The air in the conference room was thick, not just with cigar smoke, but with a palpable tension that seemed to cling to the polished oak table and the somber faces of the German High Command. Around that imposing table sat the crème de la crème of the Wehrmacht, their uniforms immaculate, adorned with medals that spoke of past glories, their expressions carefully constructed masks of deference and apprehension. At the head of this grim assembly sat Adolf Hitler, Führer and Supreme Commander, his gaze often sweeping over those present, searching, judging. Standing before him, poised to deliver a briefing that would irrevocably alter his destiny, was General Franz Halder, the Chief of the General Staff of the Army. Since 1938, Halder had been the architect of Germany's lightning victories, the audacious thrusts through Poland, the stunning conquest of France and the Low Countries, operations that had cemented Germany's mastery over continental Europe. He was a master of logistics, a meticulous planner, and a man who understood the cold, hard calculus of war. But now, in the unforgiving autumn of 1942, Halder was about to commit an act of unforgivable defiance in the Third Reich. He was about to tell Adolf Hitler the unvarnished truth. The truth concerned Stalingrad. For 2 grueling months, General Friedrich Paulus's Sixth Army had been locked in a brutal, house-to-house, street-by-street struggle for the Soviet industrial city on the Volga River. Progress was agonizingly slow, measured in mere meters, bought with an ever-increasing deluge of blood. Casualties were mounting catastrophically, far exceeding any strategic gains. Halder, with his analytical mind, had crunched the numbers, the grim arithmetic of attrition and supply. He began his briefing with the incontrovertible facts, his voice steady despite the tremor of history in the room. "Mein Führer," he began, his tone devoid of emotion, "the Sixth Army has sustained over 80,000 casualties since August 1st. Soviet reinforcements continue to flow across the Volga River under the cover of darkness every night. Our supply lines are stretched dangerously thin, extending hundreds of kilometers across the vast open steppe, a terrain where Soviet partisan activity is escalating and disrupting our vital convoys. Furthermore, winter's brutal grip is fast approaching, and our forces are critically unprepared for its onslaught." Then Halder delivered the words that sealed his fate, words that hung in the air like a death knell. "Mein Führer, we cannot take Stalingrad with the forces currently available. The projected cost in men and material will tragically exceed any conceivable strategic benefit. I earnestly recommend that we consolidate our present positions, prepare robust winter defenses, and defer offensive operations until spring, when we can ensure proper resupply and reinforcement." The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating. Every officer in that room understood the magnitude of Halder's transgression. He had directly contradicted the Führer. He had dared to suggest retreat, implying that Hitler's sacred strategy was flawed, even disastrous. These were not merely career-ending statements. In Nazi Germany, they were potentially life-ending. Hitler's face, usually a canvas of furious intensity, began to darken, a slow, terrifying flush spreading from his neck upwards. His voice, when it finally broke the oppressive silence, was initially quiet, a low, controlled growl that was always more menacing than his more characteristic, screaming rages. "You recommend withdrawal?" Hitler hissed, his eyes narrowed to slits of cold fury. "You who have overseen every retreat and setback of this campaign? You who have constantly counseled caution and hesitation, while I, the Führer, have delivered victory after victory." Halder stood his ground, a lone sentinel of reason against a tide of fanatical delusion. This was his defining moment. He could recant, apologize, equivocate, perhaps save his career, even his life. Or he could stand by the complete truth, knowing it would shatter his military future. He chose truth. Mein Führer, Halder reiterated, his voice gaining a quiet but firm resolve. I have meticulously studied the logistics. The Sixth Army requires approximately 700 tons of supplies daily to maintain combat effectiveness. We are currently capable of delivering, on a good day, perhaps 300 tons. As winter descends, this capacity will only diminish further. Moreover, intelligence reports indicate that the Soviet forces in Stalingrad are not collapsing. On the contrary, they are preparing a major counteroffensive, most likely targeting our exposed flanks, which are thinly held by our Romanian and Italian allies, woefully equipped with inadequate anti-tank weaponry. If we continue to concentrate our most vital forces in Stalingrad itself, we risk the catastrophic encirclement of the entire Sixth Army. The chilling specificity of Halder's assessment did not assuage Hitler. It inflamed him further. This wasn't vague concern. It was detailed, unassailable analysis that directly challenged Hitler's fervent vision of inevitable victory. Halder was wielding facts and logistics like weapons against the Führer's unwavering ideology and willpower. Hitler surged to his feet, the last vestiges of his controlled rage dissolving into a furious crescendo. "You dare to tell me what is possible and impossible," he roared, his voice now booming through the room. "I, who have achieved what every expert said was impossible. I, who conquered France in 6 weeks when your precious general staff predicted years. I, who have raised Germany from the ashes of defeat to the undisputed mastery of Europe." Halder attempted to interject. "Mein Führer, I am not questioning your—" "Mathematics!" Hitler bellowed, cutting him off, his face contorted with rage. "Always you speak of mathematics and logistics and caution. Wars are not won by accountants, General. Wars are won by will, by indomitable determination, by the absolute refusal to accept defeat. The Bolsheviks are on the verge of collapse. Stalingrad is the linchpin. Once it falls, the entire Soviet position on the Volga collapses. We will control the river. We will control access to the Caucasus oil fields. We will win this war." "But at what cost?" Halder interjected, his voice rising, unable to contain the urgency of his conviction. "Even if we take Stalingrad, which will require at least another month of this grinding urban combat, we will be left with an exhausted army holding an exposed position deep in Soviet territory, with winter fast approaching and supply lines that cannot possibly sustain it." "Enough!" Hitler's hands slammed down on the table, rattling the teacups. "I am surrounded by pessimists and defeatists, by men who see only obstacles instead of opportunities, by generals who want to retreat at the first sign of resistance. You, Halder, have been a brake on this army's true potential since the very beginning. You opposed the attack on France. You opposed the invasion of the Soviet Union. You have opposed every bold stroke that has led to German victory. And now, you oppose Stalingrad." The accusation, while harsh, held a kernel of truth. Halder had indeed expressed grave concerns about many of Hitler's more reckless decisions. Yet, he had also brilliantly executed those very plans, often turning high-risk gambles into resounding successes. The fatal flaw was that Hitler only remembered the objections, never the victories. In Hitler's twisted worldview, anyone who questioned him was, by definition, wrong, because he, the Führer, was infallible. Other officers in the room shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting nervously. Some undoubtedly agreed with Halder's stark assessment. Field commanders from the Eastern Front had been sending increasingly desperate reports mirroring Halder's concerns about overstretched supply lines and utterly exhausted troops. But none dared to speak. They had all learned the bitter lesson. Agreeing with criticism of Hitler's strategy was not just career suicide. It was often an invitation to the Gestapo. Halder made one final desperate attempt. "Mein Führer, I have served Germany faithfully, with all my professional—" "You have served your own timidity," Hitler roared, cutting him off once more. "You have served your outdated general staff thinking. You have not served the grand vision that Germany requires. I need generals who believe in victory, not accountants who merely count costs." Hitler turned abruptly to Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, his most obsequious and blindly loyal subordinate. "Halder is relieved of command as Chief of the General Staff, effective immediately. He will be replaced by General Kurt Zeitzler, perhaps a younger officer with fresh Eastern Front experience, will possess the aggressive spirit this vital position demands." Halder, his face a mask of weary resignation, unclipped the insignia from his collar and placed them deliberately on the polished oak table. He had known this moment was inevitable from the instant he had chosen honesty over sycophancy. He executed a formal, precise salute, a final dignified gesture of a professional soldier, and turned to leave the room. His distinguished military career was over. He would spend the remainder of the war in enforced retirement, a ghost haunting the margins of a regime he had once served with brilliance. He would eventually be arrested after the failed July 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler, though he was not directly involved, accused merely by association with others who had dared to dream of a Germany without its Führer. But as he walked out into the cool September air, Halder knew with chilling certainty that he had been right. Every calculation he'd made, every concern he'd voiced, was terrifyingly accurate. And in the next 4 months, he would be proven horrifically, devastatingly correct. The very counteroffensive he had so precisely predicted was launched exactly 8 weeks later. On November 19, 1942, Soviet forces, under the codename Operation Uranus, struck with overwhelming force against the thinly spread Romanian positions north and south of Stalingrad, precisely where Halder had warned the German flanks were most vulnerable. The Romanians, ill-equipped, undersupplied, and lacking adequate anti-tank weapons, collapsed within hours under the weight of the Soviet onslaught. By November 23rd, the massive pincer movement closed. The entire German Sixth Army, over 280,000 men, was encircled within the shattered ruins of the city Hitler had insisted must be taken at all costs. The supply crisis Halder had calculated with such precision materialized with brutal reality. The Luftwaffe, attempting to supply the trapped pocket by air, never came close to the required 700 tons daily. Most days, they delivered a meager 100 tons or less. Soldiers starved. Essential equipment failed from lack of fuel and spare parts. Medical supplies dwindled to nothing. Men froze to death in inadequate winter shelters, their emaciated bodies piled in the snow. The trapped commanders of the Sixth Army, including General Paulus, sent desperate, increasingly frantic messages requesting permission to break out of the encirclement while there was still a sliver of hope. Hitler, remembering Halder's defeatist advice about withdrawal and utterly determined to prove that willpower could conquer logistics, adamantly refused. The army would hold Stalingrad. Relief forces would break through. The situation would be restored through sheer determination and fighting spirit. But determination does not create food where there is none. Willpower does not generate ammunition. Fighting spirit does not warm frozen soldiers or heal wounded men without medical supplies. The cold, unforgiving mathematics that Halder had presented proved inexorable. By December, the Sixth Army was combat ineffective, a ghost of its former self. By January, soldiers were succumbing to starvation and exposure in horrifying numbers. Finally, on February 2, 1943, the shattered survivors surrendered. Of the approximately 280,000 men trapped, a mere 91,000 survived to enter Soviet captivity. Most would perish from disease, starvation, and exhaustion in the brutal Soviet prisoner-of-war camps. Only about 6,000 ever returned to Germany after the war. Halder watched all of this unfold from his forced retirement, a bitter spectator to a catastrophe he had accurately foreseen and desperately tried to prevent. He meticulously kept detailed diaries, documents that would later become invaluable historical records. In them, he recorded his profound frustration at having been right while being dismissed as wrong. He documented, with chilling precision, the exact ways in which his dire predictions had materialized, and he reflected deeply on the fundamental, systemic problem that had destroyed him and would ultimately destroy Germany itself. The problem, as Halder clearly understood, was that Hitler had meticulously cultivated a system where truth was whatever he decreed it to be. Facts that dared to contradict his grandiose vision were summarily dismissed as defeatism, pessimism, or even treason. Officers who presented accurate, realistic assessments were accused of lacking fighting spirit, of being weak, of betraying the Führer. The entire military command structure had been corrupted, warped by the overriding need to tell Hitler what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to know. Halder had tried to be the exception, a bastion of professional integrity in a sea of sycophancy. He tried to maintain the rigorous standards of honest assessment and realistic planning that were the bedrock of true military professionalism. But in Hitler's Germany, professional competence was irrevocably subordinate to ideological loyalty. Better to be wrong and loyal than right and critical. The yes men thrived. The truth-tellers were purged. General Kurt Zeitzler, Halder's successor, initially embodied the aggressive optimism Hitler so craved. But within months, confronted with the same inescapable realities, Zeitzler, too, found himself presenting the very same concerns about Stalingrad that Halder had so prophetically voiced. The tragic difference was that by then, the Sixth Army was already trapped, its fate sealed. Zeitzler's belated honesty came too late to prevent disaster. It could only serve to document its grim unfolding. Hitler's response to Zeitzler was a chilling echo of his treatment of Halder: dismissal of concerns, accusations of defeatism, and an unyielding insistence that willpower would ultimately prevail. Zeitzler lasted longer than Halder, but he too was eventually dismissed after repeatedly requesting permission for tactical retreats that might have saved German forces. He suffered a nervous breakdown in 1944 and was removed from command. This devastating pattern repeated throughout the war. Competent generals who dared to tell Hitler the unvarnished truth were swiftly fired. Sycophants who whispered only what he wanted to hear were promoted, regardless of their actual abilities. As a direct consequence, German military operations became increasingly detached from strategic reality, veering into the realm of desperate fantasy. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, arguably Germany's most capable general, managed this delicate, treacherous balance better than most. He would present realistic assessments, but he carefully framed them in ways that avoided direct contradiction of Hitler's directives. He would request flexible defense rather than retreat. He would emphasize strategic repositioning instead of withdrawal. This semantic tightrope walk sometimes worked, but it also meant that even Germany's best military minds were forced to expend precious energy on managing Hitler's fragile ego rather than focusing solely on the existential struggle of the war. The profound tragedy of Halder's firing wasn't merely that Germany lost a capable chief of staff. It was that the incident sent an unambiguous, terrifying message throughout the entire Wehrmacht. Telling the Führer the truth is far more dangerous than losing battles. This created an insidious atmosphere where officers at all levels learned to distort, suppress, or outright invent information that might anger Hitler. Intelligence reports were softened. Casualty figures were minimized. Enemy strength was systematically underestimated. Critical supply problems were disastrously downplayed. This systematic distortion of information flowed upwards through the command structure, meaning Hitler's decisions were increasingly based on fictional assessments of reality. He was making strategic choices based on what his subordinates thought he wanted to hear, rather than what was actually happening on the battlefields. This information gap widened relentlessly throughout the war, contributing to catastrophically poor decisions in 1943, 1944, and 1945. The Battle of Stalingrad became the stark, brutal symbol of this profound dysfunction. Hitler had insisted the city could and must be taken, driven by powerful political and psychological imperatives. Halder had countered that it could not be taken, or at least not at an acceptable cost, because the immutable laws of logistics simply did not support it. Halder was fired for this accurate assessment, and then reality proved Halder horrifically correct in the most catastrophic way imaginable. Yet, even after the unmitigated disaster of Stalingrad, Hitler did not learn the lesson. He did not recognize that firing honest advisors was utterly counterproductive. Instead, he doubled down on his delusion. The defeats, in his mind, must have been caused by incompetent or treasonous generals. The solution was to exert even more personal control, to rely even less on professional military advice, to trust his infallible intuition over mere expert analysis. This destructive pattern continued remorselessly to the very end of the war. In 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, Hitler famously refused to release crucial panzer reserves, convinced that the landing was merely a feint and the real invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais. His generals knew better, but they had learned not to contradict him too forcefully. By the time Hitler grudgingly accepted that Normandy was the main invasion, it was too late to mount an effective counterattack. In 1945, as Soviet forces inexorably approached Berlin, Hitler was still moving phantom divisions on maps, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed, planning counteroffensives with resources that had been destroyed months earlier. His remaining staff knew the situation was utterly hopeless, but they continued to execute meaningless orders because they had learned that truth-telling was punished, while obedient failure was merely unfortunate. Franz Halder survived the war. Ironically, he was arrested by the Americans and subsequently served as a valuable consultant for historical research about German military operations. He provided detailed, often searing testimony about the dysfunctional, toxic relationship between Hitler and the General Staff. He painstakingly explained how professional military planning had been utterly subordinated to ideological fantasy. He documented, with chilling precision, the exact ways in which Hitler's megalomaniacal refusal to accept reality had led to a cascade of strategic disasters that ultimately doomed Germany. In his later writings, Halder reflected on his firing with a complex mixture of feelings. On one hand, being proven right was cold comfort when hundreds of thousands of men had died unnecessarily, senselessly. On the other hand, he had maintained his professional integrity in the face of immense pressure, when it would have been infinitely easier and safer to simply go along with the collective delusion. He had told the truth when truth-telling was a dangerous act of rebellion, and he had paid a heavy personal price for it. The lesson of Halder's firing extends far beyond military history. It stands as a profound case study in what happens when institutions, be they armies, corporations, or governments, prioritize blind loyalty over essential competence. When criticism is branded as betrayal. When leaders deliberately surround themselves with yes men, rather than experts willing to deliver uncomfortable truths. The pattern is tragically recognizable across history and across myriad types of organizations. Leaders who punish truth-tellers inevitably create systems where truth becomes an increasingly rare and precious commodity. Subordinates learn to tell leaders what they want to hear, rather than what they desperately need to know. Decisions are made based on comfortable fictions rather than uncomfortable facts, and eventually, inevitably, reality asserts itself in catastrophic ways that could have been avoided if someone, somewhere, had been willing to listen to the Halders of the world. September 24, 1942, was the day Adolf Hitler fired one of his most brilliant and honest generals for simply telling the truth about Stalingrad. But it was also the day Hitler effectively guaranteed that Stalingrad would become the unfathomable catastrophe Halder had so accurately predicted. By removing the one advisor willing to speak honestly, Hitler ensured that no one else would dare to try. The truth about Stalingrad became unspeakable, and an unspeakable truth led directly to an unspeakable tragedy. Franz Halder lived until 1972, long enough to witness the rebuilding of Germany from its ashes, to see the Wehrmacht's professional reputation partially rehabilitated by historians, and to see those historians finally recognize, unequivocally, that he had been right about Stalingrad. But he also lived long enough to know that being right had mattered less than being believed, and that telling the truth had cost him everything, while lying had cost Germany and the world far, far more. The firing of Franz Halder was not just a personnel decision, it was a stark, defining choice between reality and fantasy, between professional competence and ideological purity, between honest assessment and comfortable delusion. Hitler chose wrong, and 280,000 men at Stalingrad paid the ultimate, horrific price for that catastrophic choice.